Thank you. So although it'll be physically my voice, you should imagine it's an EGSO chorus coming forth here. Steve was an extraordinary mentor to so many of us. We discovered who we are. Indeed, we became who we are in conversation with Steve. And he had a seemingly limitless appetite for those conversations. I suppose he, in part, became who he was in conversation with us. By the time this current EGSO crop arrived at UMass, he was to us the old man. Steve, for his part, referred to Marx as the old man, but did describe himself as an old man. Illustrations of his appetite for conversation. Illustration 1, Steve hurrying in late to class, explaining the delay by saying he'd been deep in conversation with one of our colleagues. The delay in starting the class is shorter than the delay in ending. Illustration 2, a time-lapse sequence of images, composite images. So many of us had meetings like this. First image, a student approaching a meeting with Steve, perhaps feeling uncertain, a bit intimidated. Second image, the student starting to explain what she'd been working on, thinking about, and Steve listening intently, not yet speaking. Next, Steve responding, questioning, pushing our ideas farther, deeper. Sometime later, the first line of inquiry beginning to wind down, Steve asking, what else? This is your time. The conversation renews in intensity. Final image, at last, after 2 hours, maybe 3, the student leaves exhilarated. An audio clip. I don't know anyone else who can make this sound, so I'll have to ask you to call it up from memory. Steve laughing. Laughing with the pleasure and the excitement of the work we all did together. Undergraduates flocked to his classes, which always had long waiting lists, and at EGSO allocation meetings, Steve's sections were snapped up quickly by TAs eager both to learn what he taught and to observe how he taught. 4 decades of graduate students took his classes and wrote dissertations under his guidance. His brilliant mentoring and teaching were no accident. Certainly, he must have had some innate talent for it, a reliable intuition for what his students needed and how to connect with us, but it wasn't just instinct. He approached teaching with the same analytical clarity, the same commitment to making explicit his philosophical foundations, and the same moral urgency he brought to his research. The teaching and the research were 2 aspects of the same life's work. Let's bring back that image of Steve in that meeting with a student after listening, at last responding. He was likely to say something like, I like that, what you just did. Do that again. He used the word do for thinking, theorizing, persuading. The knowledge of knowledge in class wasn't just some kind of passive representation of the world. It was a material intervention in it. It was that view of knowledge as active transformation that is in part responsible for him being such an effective and committed teacher. The other half of knowledge in class, of course, is class. The material intervention he was committed to making through his theory and through his teaching was to oppose class exploitation. We admired Steve for those convictions that he held deepest, for his commitment to revealing knowledge that is denied and suppressed. Steve trained as an economist to study the economy, but the formal education he received, as he told us, this education he received from Nobel Prize winners did not critique capitalism. Steve had to learn elsewhere and on his own about capitalism, and what he learned is that what happens in a capitalist enterprise, a corporation, is that workers, employees, produce more value than they receive in wages. The employer, the corporation, the board of directors receives the extra value, the surplus that the workers produce but don't get. This is class exploitation. This is a social theft, but this theft, unlike most theft, is accepted, or rather denied. Economists collaborate in denying that this is happening. Steve went a step beyond most economists by seeing that an economics discipline that denies the existence of this exploitation is part of the problem he wanted to oppose. That this surplus, which Steve estimated to be trillions of dollars a year, is stolen from the workers who produced it. This suppression of knowledge is not new in the history of the economics discipline or any history. In the 1930s, the economics discipline denied that there was a business cycle, and it took courageous heretics to insist that the business cycle was an inherent part of the economic system. Steve belongs to this tradition of courageous heretics. Steve's position was that exploitation is socially destructive. If he could change one thing about the world, it would be to end class exploitation. Though even so, he never dismissed other forms of social oppression, other components of human experience, or reduced them to class. Class was the analytical entry point he chose, but never the only thing that mattered. Steve was deliberate in teaching what made people uncomfortable, but it was provocation with a purpose. He did this because he taught us that human knowledge and human well-being grow together. A classic example of his provocation was his response to a common focus on economic growth and employment. I always thought, he wrote once in an email, that a fully employed capitalist economy was also a fully exploited economy. Steve persuaded many of us to care about class. Still, his effectiveness as a teacher wasn't that he taught us to think what he thought. He taught us to think what we thought. Mark Silverman tells a story about arguing with Steve over the years about the concept of overdetermination, being partially convinced, but other parts doubting. And eventually, Steve told Mark, as Mark says probably to shut him up, "You know, I think you have a point, write a paper on it." So somewhere in the writing process, Mark got really nervous about being so critical of Steve. And Steve's response was, these are Steve's words, "Put this political thin-skin crap out of your head, and I insist you mention me by name wherever and whenever warranted by the critique. The most important thing is for you to argue, intervene in making the point. That also can give me, us, and still others, a chance to argue with you in the future." I had a somewhat similar experience early in my work with him. I tried out an idea I was thinking about, and he disagreed emphatically. I said, "Okay, I'll think about it some more, but what happens if I convince myself and I can't persuade you?" He said that would be okay. His standard was that he had to understand my argument, but he didn't have to be persuaded by it. Along with the intellectual rigor he brought to teaching, there was Steve's frank acknowledgement of teaching as emotional labor. He told students beginning dissertations with him that the work matters, and he would read the work carefully and critically, but his main job would be to hold our hands and tell us it will be all right and we can do it. Writing a dissertation is hard, he warned us, and not that many people understand what we're doing and how hard it is. There aren't that many places to turn for the support we need, so he offered it. Another manifestation of his respect and support for us as thinkers was his respect and support for EGSO. He was an EGSO ally in efforts to strengthen graduate students' say in the governance of the department and the dimensions of our education. And he supported our opposition on time limits on funding. Learning so many different perspectives, as we do at UMass, takes time. Steve understood the value of taking time. He wrote to Tomas last year, "When we put together the package at UMass, I said to myself and to Rick that I will write nothing more for a few years until I can figure out what is my problem with the Marxian tradition out of which I came. So Rick and I decided to go back to school and read and reread everything and discuss. That is one luxury of academic life. It was one of the best periods of my life." Steve remained astoundingly generous with his time, even when he must have known that he had precious little left, though he never let on. We can't help but wish that he had more time, that we had more time with him, but we are grateful for the time we did have. We can still look to him as a model for how to use our time, and we can now look to each other as we keep learning about Steve, about ourselves, about our discipline, and about our world. Thank you.